In October 1927, engineers from the Iraq Petroleum Company drilled a borehole near Kirkuk in northern Iraq. They struck black gold. Within 5 years, the company had drilled 32 wells and was extracting nearly 50,000 tons of oil a day. Having made out like bandits from this scheme, the company now needed to move the oil in vast quantities across the desert so that it could find its way into the cars, planes, and ships of the British and French empires. To do so, around 1932, they constructed a vast pipeline from Kirkuk to Haifa on the Mediterranean. In order to keep the oil flowing, the pipe had 12 large pumping stations along its length. These were grouped together in 3 sections heading westward. First were the K stations from Kirkuk to Haditha, then the 5 H stations, creatively named H1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, that took the oil to the British port of Haifa, and the 4 T stations that terminated in the French port of Tripoli. Because they were in relatively remote locations, several of the pumping stations had small airfields built nearby to facilitate easy movement of people and supplies. H-3 was a remote station in western Iraq, located in the desert 270 miles from Baghdad, close to the border with Syria. It had a rudimentary strip and limited facilities, but it was regularly used. During the Second World War, the British used H-3 as a staging point for an attack on the oil terminal at Palmyra in Vichy-held Syria. The job of taking Palmyra fell to the Hab Force under General Clark and the Arab Legion. Australian P-40 Tomahawks operating from H-3 helped the Allied forces take the city after 2 days of bitter fighting. Iraq had gained its independence in 1932, and in the aftermath of the war took advantage of the end of empire to truly become an independent country. With its oil wealth, its government was able to build a powerful military to protect its independence in a volatile region. Unfortunately, security did not bring stability. There were 3 coups between 1958 and 1967, with the accompanying death and strife. Even so, on the 5th of June 1967, the Iraqi Air Force was well equipped, and to some extent well trained. Its fighter force was made up of Hawker Hunters, of which the IRAF had acquired 50 in various versions, and about 70 MiG-21s. 2/3 of these were the versatile but now aging F-13, armed with a cannon and 2 ATOL infrared homing missiles, and the other third of the aircraft were FLs, armed with missiles only. For attack, the IRF had 14 Tu-16 Badgers, 8 bomber types, and 6 with the equipment to launch AS-1 Kennel cruise missiles. In support were a variety of older, generally Soviet types. Iraq had received a great deal of support in setting up its military from the British. Its pilots were generally well trained, although some of its best were not well trusted because of their political history, and therefore the Air Force's autonomy was quite limited. The Iraqis were supplemented by experienced East German, Polish, Libyan, and Pakistani pilots, who were essentially state-sanctioned mercenaries. Some of them would play important but anonymous roles in the war to come. H-3 was still quite a rudimentary airfield in 1967. It had a single tarmac runway, a small fuel bunker, and minimal servicing and rearming facilities. The ruins of an old fortress overlooked the airfield. Personnel slept in tents around the aircraft and on the base infield. Air defense was provided by a battery of Soviet 100mm guns, but there were no smaller rapid-firing weapons. It thus remained more of a staging post between Iraq and Jordan than an airbase. As luck would have it, 2 squadrons of hunters were on the way to Mafraq on June the 5th, as were MiG-21 FLs of No. 17 Squadron. A squadron of veteran MiG-17s were also due to arrive later in the week, suggesting crowded conditions on the small base were to come. But then on the 5th, waves of Israeli aircraft crossed the border into Egypt and descended on the Egyptian Air Force's bases. Bombing and strafing, they knocked out dozens of Egyptian aircraft, cratered the runways, and smashed the infrastructure. Later that day, they turned their attention to Syria. In the chaos and indecision that accompanied the strikes, word filtered out to the other Arab militaries about what was occurring. Being reasonably well run, by midday on the 5th, the IRAF was ordered to strike back. The Iraqi pilots had been expecting to move out to Jordan and had contented themselves with flying familiarization flights around H-3 while they waited. The news of the Israeli attack that arrived shortly after 10 a.m. was not wholly unexpected. At 12:15 Baghdad time, 5 hunters of Number 6 Squadron IRAF launched from H-3. Unfortunately, a decade of coups had led to Iraq's intelligence about Israeli facilities and operations being rather poor. The latest maps of the area were British ones dating back to 1948 and the British Mandate. They were followed an hour later by another formation of 3 hunters. The Iraqi aircraft flew low, easily dipping under Israeli radar coverage and then splitting to attack their targets, following the pipeline to help them navigate. They each carried 24 3-inch rockets under the wings, a pair of drop tanks, and a full load of 30mm ammunition for their 4 Aden cannons. The first flight headed to Kfar Sirkin, formerly RAF Sirkin. This had been the Israeli Air Force's flight academy until 1955, but when that operation moved to Tel Nof, it was used for paratroop training and as a dispersal site for transport aircraft. The other 3 hunters headed for Lod International Airport, now known as Ben Gurion. The hunters caught the Israelis completely by surprise. At Kfar Sirkin, they rocketed the ramp, destroying at least 1 Nor Atlas transport, damaging other transport aircraft and the control tower. But then 2 Hawk SAMs intervened, fired from a battery near Tel Nof. They forced the hunters to take evasive action and escape. The Iraqi pilots would later claim 7 Nor Atlases and Dakotas destroyed in the attack. The Israelis admitted to a single Nor Atlas and a civilian Piper Cub. The Lod flight failed to find their target entirely. All 8 hunters returned to base safely. Belatedly, Jordanian aircraft also joined in the action, drawing swift retribution from the IAF. But curiously, the Israelis had not planned to attack Iraq. They did, however, have to respond to the threat from the east so they could maintain the pressure on Egypt and Syria. So while their aircraft were knocking out the Jordanian Air Force, a force of 4 Vautour bombers were dispatched from Ramat David to attack H-3, which was the most exposed of the Iraqi bases. 1 aircraft aborted almost immediately with a technical problem. Taking off moments after the raid on Kfar Sirkin, they followed the pipeline east, skimming the desert floor and arriving over the field only an hour after the last hunters had landed. Once again, the attackers were let down by poor intelligence, though. In this case, the Israelis had missed the arrival of 4 MiG-21 FLs in the late morning of the 5th. 2 of these were on combat air patrol when the Vautours showed up. The Vautour was a rugged, quite fast, and heavily armed strike fighter, but even so, they were no match for the supersonic, agile MiG-21. Fortunately for the Israeli pilots, the FL had no cannon though, and its ATOL missiles were completely useless in a head-on attack and mostly useless in a stern chase. The Iraqi pilots were therefore unable to prevent the Vautours strafing and rocketing. 3 parked MiG-21s, a Hunter that had just returned from Lod, a de Havilland Dove, and an Antonov AN-12 transport were all shut up. The Israelis escaped with no casualties. The Iraqis had taken some losses, but were mentally well up for the fight, and they still had plenty of aircraft available. Overnight, the Iraqi High Command in Baghdad decided that they should strike Ramat David and the Israeli advance into the West Bank as hard as possible the next morning. Unfortunately, the facilities at H-3 really didn't allow for a very high sortie rate. So at daybreak, 6 hunters were all that took off, armed with 8 60-pound rockets each. 4 of them headed towards the West Bank and the other 2 towards Ramat David, once again following the pipeline. 1 turned back with a mechanical problem almost immediately. 4 Tu-16 Badgers based at Habania followed the hunters, carrying 6 500-kilogram Fab 500 bombs each. Once again, the Iraqi arrival was a total surprise to the Israeli defenders. The first 4 hunters swept in from the east, launching rockets into a formation of Israeli armoured vehicles and trucks parked on the Nazareth to Haifa highway, killing 5 soldiers, injuring 8, and destroying several vehicles before escaping unhindered by Israeli defences. The attack on Ramat David was less successful. The pair of hunters leading the expedition mistakenly attacked 2 villages near the base. The first Tu-16, following some miles behind, also got lost and dropped a stick of bombs on an IDF base near Tirnik, again causing some casualties, but in the wrong place. The next 2 bombers in the formation suffered technical problems and had to abort, leaving the 4th to make its attack alone. This Badger approached Ramat David at around 8:30 in the morning, seemingly without any response from the IDF. But the crew misjudged their approach and decided to swing around and make another pass. For reasons that will likely never be known, the crew decided to drop their bombs on the main street of Netanya, a town near Ramat David, causing significant civilian casualties on the ground. They were then intercepted by a pair of Mirage 3 CJs who attempted a firing pass from behind, but the Israeli pilots apparently forgot that the Badger had a tail turret. The rear gunner fired bursts from his 23mm cannons, forcing the Mirage pilots to break off. With the fighters in hot pursuit, the Iraqi pilot put his bomber into a dive and thundered low over Ramat David, just as the strike package being assembled to strike H-3 again was being put together on the taxiway. Although a successful and long-lived aircraft, the Badger was a strange one in some ways. Capable of high subsonic speeds and able to operate comfortably at altitudes above 40,000 feet, it also mounted a curiously strong defensive gun armament more akin to a Second World War bomber. The Iraqi Tu-16s thus had their tail turret, plus two further turrets, one on the ventral and one on the dorsal spine of the aircraft. These turrets opened up as the bomber flew over the airfield, sowing 23mm shells amongst the Israeli ground crew while soldiers on the ground fired up at the bomber with machine guns. This crazy scene was interrupted by the Mirages, one of which fired a pair of Shafrir air-to-air missiles from close range. One missile went wild, but the other exploded close to the bomber, which staggered off to the east, damaged but still flyable. Unfortunately for the crew, they then passed over an IDF base at Megiddo. The defenders opened fire with their 40mm Bofors, hitting the Badger again. This time the damage was fatal. The Badger went in and crashed into a military storage complex hidden within a pine forest west of Afula, destroying 3 barracks and 2 teams of 120mm mortars, killing both the Badger crew of 5 and about a dozen Israeli reservists. With this disturbance past, the Israeli counterstrike package of 4 Voteurs took off towards H-3, this time accompanied by a pair of Mirages. They reached the airfield just as the 2 Hunters that had attacked Ramat David earlier that morning were about to land. 2 MiG-21s and 2 Hunters were preparing to take off to establish a combat air patrol. The Israelis didn't spot the 2 Hunters in the landing pattern, but the Voteurs dove on the Hunters trying to take off. In a panic, the flight leader, Captain Abdel Wahid Yazbaki, who had led the raid on Kfar Sukin the day before, pulled up with too little airspeed. His Hunter stalled, dropped wing, and crashed into H-3's main water tank, killing him instantly. The other Hunter and the MiGs engaged the Israelis in a swirling dogfight. One of the Voteurs was hit heavily by 30mm cannon fire from a Hunter. Before the Iraqi could finish the job, though, he was engaged by one of the Mirages, which caused damage on the Iraqi fighter with its cannon. Both aircraft made it back to base, though, despite claims to the contrary from both sides. The faster MiG-21s made a wide turn before accelerating to attack the Israelis as they were withdrawing to the west. The MiG flight lead, piloted by a Major Sarah, fired his 2 ATOLs at a Mirage, but the Israeli pilot knew exactly what he was doing. He broke into the missiles to evade them and then set up a gunshot on the MiG. A 30mm round punctured the fishbed's rear fuselage and caused the braking parachute to deploy. Major Sarah made a sharp break and managed to disengage. His wingman fired 2 missiles at a Voteur, but once again the ATOLs failed to track, preferring the look of the desert floor to the attack aircraft's hot exhausts. Once again, everyone returned to base. The Israeli pilots claiming kills they hadn't actually made, and the Iraqis once again cursing the poor quality of the Soviet missiles. The scene was now set for the final and most significant battle for H-3. In the overnight sortie planning process, the IDF decided that their pilots' reports about the destruction at H-3 were not entirely to be believed. They'd narrowly avoided a defeat at Ramat David because of the Iraqis' poor navigation, and since the IRAF's losses were thus far quite minimal and its will to fight quite high, H-3 needed to be properly put out of action. 4 Voteurs and 4 Mirages were tasked to this mission, which was to set off at dawn. This time the Mirages would also carry a pair of bombs to make sure that the job was completed. On the Iraqi side, the commanders in Baghdad had decided on the 6th that H-3 was now untenable, as it would undoubtedly face further attacks. On the face of it, this seems like rather a craven decision. Although the base would undoubtedly be attacked, even basic intelligence gathering would show them that the Israelis were unlikely to be able to mass a decisive force. Most of the Israeli air assets were supporting the drive into the Sinai and the Golan Heights. As the order to retreat was being enacted, a column of Jordanian vehicles carrying the surviving Jordanian and Pakistani pilots of Number 1 Squadron RJAF, which had been smashed on the ground on the 5th, arrived. They found H-3 smoking and chaotic on the late afternoon of the 6th of June. Since there were no aircraft there, they had to continue their journey all the way to Habania in western central Iraq, arriving in the very early morning of the 7th. They didn't have much time to rest, as they were woken up and ordered to join the Iraqi hunter squadrons in establishing a combat air patrol over H-3 and over the highway to Amman, upon which an Iraqi armoured column was rumbling out to reinforce the Jordanians. The IRAF at this point had the remainder of their 50 hunters at Habaniya, but nowhere near enough experienced pilots to fly them. With the arrival of the MiG-21, the most experienced pilots in the IRAF now flew the Fishbed, and the Hunter had been relegated to a ground attack bird flown by new recruits. The Jordanians and their foreign pilots, being far more experienced, particularly in air-to-air combat, thus took over the flight lead positions. At 0700, the first cap launched, but having patrolled for about an hour over the base, the four-ship found nothing and returned. The next patrol went up at 10:15. Their plan was to orbit over H-3, then land and refuel there before taking off for another period on station and then returning to Habaniya. As they arrived over their former base at about 25,000 feet in clear skies, they were radioed by the ground commander at H-3, who relayed a report from an army unit on the road from Baghdad to Damascus who had spotted 8 aircraft coming in on the deck from the west. The Hunter formation punched off their tanks and dove in on the Israelis. The first element went for the escorting Mirages, while the second attacked the Vautours. Once again, the Mirage pilots demonstrated their experience and training. The leading pair of Mirages dropped their bombs on H-3, immediately looped back in full burner and came in behind the trailing pair of Hunters. A burst of cannon fire sent the Iraqi number 4 down in flames. His aircraft landed in the base's fuel bunker, causing a huge explosion and plumes of black smoke. The victory was momentary. Although by no means as sophisticated as a Mirage, the Hunter was both more maneuverable and more heavily armed. Its quad 30mm battery was one of the most powerful gun systems ever fitted to a tactical fighter. The Iraqi flight leader bounced the Mirage leader, laced his aircraft with 30mm fire, causing an explosion that disabled the hydraulic system and forced the pilot, a Captain Draw, to eject. Braking to the right, the Hunter pilot, Flight Lieutenant Azam, a Pakistani exchange pilot, saw a Vautour approaching head-on, but below his flight level. He inverted the Hunter, went into a dive and pulled back on the stick. Almost blacking out from the G-forces, he found himself barely 150 feet behind the Israeli aircraft with positive Delta V. Instinctively, Azam extended his air brakes, put his throttle to idle, aimed and opened fire. His shells hit the Israeli aircraft hard, blasting it apart. Azam broke hard left to avoid the debris, but was still hit by multiple fragments of the exploding aircraft. His guns now jammed, preventing him from engaging more Israelis. The other element leader was an experienced Iraqi named Sumir Zainal. He lined up on another Vautour, whose pilot attempted to evade him, but then decided to attempt to outrun the Hunter. Zainal lined up and scored devastating hits on the Vautour's fuselage and wing. The pilot ejected and was captured. In the confusion, Zainal and Assam's remaining wingman, a Jordanian named Ishan Showdown, attacked another Mirage and also shot it down. This kill is controversial, as the IDF has only once admitted that it happened. Otherwise, they've stuck to the line that only 3 aircraft were lost in this raid. Pursuing the retreating Israelis, the Hunters scored more hits on the Vautours and a Mirage, but none were shot down before the Iraqi fighters were so low on fuel they had to return to base. And with that, the battle for H-3 was over. With their objectives elsewhere well in progress, the IDF elected not to attack again, although they did continue to operate over Jordan and Iraq. The Iraqis left the remnants of H-3 in place, but did not operate from it for the remainder of the war. In total, the IRAF lost 3 Hunters, 3 MiG-21s, an Antonov AN-12 and a Dove, plus the Tu-16 in the dramatic but ill-fated strike on Ramat David. 2 Hunter pilots and the Badger's crew of 5 were killed. In exchange, the Israelis lost 2 Vautours and 1 or 2 Mirages for an exchange rate of 1-3 in favour of the IRAF in air-to-air combat, but 2-1 in favour of the Israelis overall. In that assessment, I've discounted the Dove on the IRAF side and the Super Cub on the Israeli side, as honestly, who cares about liaison aircraft? H-3 is an interesting case study, as the typical narrative about the Six-Day War is that the Arab air forces were outclassed and overmatched technologically. Although small in scale and irrelevant to the overall outcome, H-3 demonstrates that when properly equipped, Iraqi and Jordanian flyers and their paid helpers were actually quite capable of matching up to the IDF. The strategic position of H-3 changed the IRAF's attitude to the base. During the 1970s, they paid Yugoslav contractors to upgrade its facilities in a program called Superbase. And duly in 1981, it would be the scene for another epic air battle.